Carter here. We got a sort of specially tailored live stream today. Not on our usual time, so I just sort of wanted to, obviously things have been insane the past week. And I mean, I look like crap today, so I hope that's evidence. But yeah, it's been challenging, and somebody that I've wanted to have on the show for a while now is a good friend of mine that I've known for a really long time. We both grew up here in Peterborough together. My friend Zach Zalman Green, who's an author. He's worked in the film industry, spent a lot of time working in Minnesota, and I felt like it would be useful for us to have him on here to sort of discuss some of the cross-community relevancies, things that we can understand in our incredibly white community, and then certain things that we can do just as a community to try and not let things get to a dangerous point here. So with that, I am going to bring on Zach right now. And Zach, welcome to the show. You're up.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Yeah, man. It's a hell of a time right now, and it's I'm really glad that you could find some time today to come on. I know that you're holding something in town a little later to discuss sort of action that we can take. But I mean, first off, I'd just love to hear your thoughts from your personal experience on just this whole situation.
Yeah, I'll try to be coherent. It's my mind is just it's going off at all. What's the expression? I can't think of it. But anyway, firing at all. Whatever. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, totally.
Today I think we're on day 9 of protesting. Memorial Day. George Floyd was murdered by the Minneapolis Police Department. There's no question about that. And as we've seen, the nation is now in uproar internationally. I think even today there was a huge gathering in Paris. So, the world has mobilized. And I think, like you brought up in your intro, so I lived in Minneapolis for 4 years, and I lived 2 blocks from where that Cup Foods was, where George Floyd was killed, and been in that store a lot. I think a lot of people, it's an interesting place. Like, people might not know that, like, it's a grocery store, it's a corner store. You can buy a cell phone there. Like, you can, buy your chicken wings, which, like, great buffalo wings, by the way, if you're in Minneapolis. Some of my favorite wings, not gonna lie. And there's also a mosque in the basement there. So it's like a very diverse, multicultural space. And right now it's been turned into a sanctuary space for George. It's like the street is totally cordoned off. There's flowers. A friend of mine's working on writing down an ongoing list of names of Black lives and brown lives that have been taken. And it's running down the length of Chicago Avenue, which is the intersection. So Chicago and 38th. It's called the Central neighborhood. It's near Powderhorn Park, which is kind of so there's like the thing that people might not understand about Minneapolis is like it's divided in a few different ways. So it's the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul. They're divided by the Mississippi River. St. Paul is divided by I-94, which is a major highway. And there's a lot of, history behind that maybe we can dive into. And Minneapolis itself is also, there's a north side and there's a south side separated by the Mississippi. And so the south side is where this all took place. And it's a very strong community. And the point I was getting to is like Powderhorn is kind of the anchor of that area. It's like, every year up until the last few years, they'd have the May Day parade. so celebrating labor and workers' rights, and just all the communities that are kind of merge there. So
Cool. Yeah. I mean, I think, my big takeaway from hearing that is like, that's like, it's really important to understand the diversity and breakdown of the geography of towns and cities themselves. I mean, like, my mind immediately jumps to like the concept of redlining and like sectioning people off into certain areas and how that can affect sort of where you'll see certain things happen, I guess.
hmm
But it's like when I think about my own time that I spent in Boston, and I like for whatever little bit of my experience that was, living in Mission Hill, a block up from the Heath Street projects, and like that was actually a really tight community. Yeah, there were problems within it for sure, just like any community has problems, but it was tight. And if you went over into JP, I mean, that was one of the most hopping places in the whole city, and I had way more fun in that part of town than I ever had downtown.
for sure.
So it's, yeah. And like I always try to consider how my experiences being raised here they did not truly equip me for what I experienced there. Like I could understand basic concepts because we live in a considerably progressive community, but at the same time, those aren't fully understood here because we just don't have that part of our population to represent us. And the one thing I always wonder about is like, how do we communicate a better understanding of this to people who just like maybe they lived in it a long time ago and it's just far in their memories, or maybe they just never lived there and they don't know at all.
Yeah, I mean, I do want to touch on it. It's interesting, like because I come back to like Peterborough, southern New Hampshire, for those of you who don't know, which I'm sure if you watch this, you know by now. But we're a lot of this town is called progressive often, and I even feel it coming out of my mouth sometimes, and I think Minneapolis is also called a very progressive city, but look what's happening, and so like that term loses more and more weight by the day. And right now, I mean, yes, progress is happening. It's happening right in front of us, and there's a whole list of things that have been accomplished just in the past week. But it's not, it's not over, and like progress doesn't mean like you get to take a pause. And but yeah, so I mean, there's that misunderstanding of it's easy to move that word around and move that idea around, but we have to really investigate like what's behind that. And I think growing up in Peterborough, and sorry if I get off topic, I'm like, this is totally new territory for me.
Hey, no worries, man. This is, I mean, I mean, for anybody who's like tuned into this so far, I mean, most episodes up until this point are just like me ranting in a space. So like, it's pretty, I try to keep it pretty informal, like we'll swear here every once in a while. Like, I don't want to pull a punch or whatever. And if we have a hard time dealing with topics, I think that's also key to the point of like, we don't fully understand stuff, and I always wanted this to be a space where we can try and explore those ideas and say like, yeah, it's okay that we don't know, we're trying to figure it out.
Yeah, and I think to that point too, that part of like investigating what progressivism means in this movement and in Peterborough is a lot of like I'm figuring it out on the fly, and like the first city I ever lived in was in Chicago, and like day one at orientation, the president of the college addressed us and said, "You're living in the most segregated city in America," and like that was his baseline was like, "Welcome to college," like welcome to Chicago, and
Right.
you know, and people who know Chicago know, like, it, you know, it's has long and deep issues with its policing and neighborhoods. Um, so, you know, and like I didn't really understand that until I like got there. I was like, okay, like I'm going to a city, like it'll be like Boston, it'll be like New York, it'll, you know, it's just, you know, fast paced, that's fine. And like I never accounted for the fact that like um that I was going to become a minority in that scenario. Um and I don't mean that in like you know, it's not that and
No, that's I think that's actually something that I seriously try, like, to me that was critical to my experience, was like all of a sudden being in like a neighborhood, just like in a local setting where I like my color was the minority, and I was like,
right.
and that like, not that that ever like made me, it didn't affect it in a way that I thought it was. It was like, I at that point I personally was like, okay, I got to stop and listen more. Like that's the
Hmm.
main
Hmm.
thing, is like I'm out of my element and I don't know what's going on here, and I just need to hear stuff out.
Right. And like I, you know, that was kind of the beginning for me of like having those conversations of race. You know, because I remember very specifically I had a friend from New Hampshire who was, you know, passing through Chicago and you know, was coming to visit, and I didn't know the city at all at that time, and like GPS, like smartphones weren't a thing yet, and it feels really dated to say. um you know, so I'm like with my flip phone, like trying to like, you know, use this GPS that, you know, takes forever, and like I'm asking people like, how do I get to this part of the city? Like I didn't know, and Chicago is massive. um and you know, and so like my friend and I were going to meet up with my friend that was visiting, and you know, we were in this neighborhood, and like, you know, kids just started like clowning on us. They just started like throwing eggs at us, and you know, like we were getting looks, and it was just like, oh fuck, like yeah, I, you know, like I'm not welcome here, and like um I was so confused by it, I was rattled by it. I didn't know how to, like, I had nowhere to put that, and I had nowhere to break that apart, because even though I grew up here in Peterborough, and like, you know, my parents you know, are very liberal minded people and very justice minded. It's all in the abstract here, and I think like
Yeah.
that's really where like this area suffers, is like kids don't get out of this town, um, you know, in large numbers. Like if you do, you know, maybe you've dabbled in Boston like yourself, or you go to New York, or um, you know, and but I think it's a small few that do that, and that's definitely like a means of privilege, like, you know, that to have access to live in those cities, because city living is very expensive, and Peterborough frankly is very expensive. So it's not much different at this point.
Yeah, no, I mean, and that's, I mean, not, that's a totally separate discussion in a lot of ways,
Right,
but yeah.
right. Yeah.
um and like, you know, and to get onto that point of like, when when I think about like what we experienced here in town, you know, as we were growing up and dealing with things, um, you know, I think we, you know, we have a hard time understanding racism here in our community in a meaningful way, because we often, you know, like there's really only so many people in our community that that can truly speak on it from the other side.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of times their experience, and I, you know, obviously I don't want to speak for anybody, but I mean, I would imagine the experience is something like you're dealing with like some sort of casual racism that's not like, it's certainly not maliciously intended. It's just like a function of an ignorance, you know, like,
Mhm. Mhm.
you know, not knowing where somebody's, you know, how to pronounce somebody's name correctly, or, you know, just, or say, oh well, you know, where are you from, or something dumb like that, you know. And it's not necessarily meant in bad taste, but it's like, and I would imagine the experience of those people who are on the receiving end of that are kind of like, I gotta roll my eyes, like, yeah, this isn't the same thing as literally getting shot in an inner city by a cop, but it's still obnoxious as hell. And like that's something I consider, and I try to look at like, okay, what's an analogous experience of people that we maybe have more of a number in our area that could kind of help us in our community understand this type of problem or this type of dynamic. And I always go back to like the relationship between youth and the older generations of the town, and the way that in this town, my experience growing up was that the police in town would really hyper focus on kids dicking around, which in a previous stream we discussed, like, that's more so a function of not having a whole lot to do. Like you're gonna start acting out when you're feeling oppressed, you're feeling unheard, you're feeling bored, any number of those things. And like in many ways I feel like that might be a place to start with, like, hey, who are we not listening to? You know what I mean? Like, and how does that expand beyond, say, just like our teenagers who are bored, but like how does that affect people that get stopped that are passing through our town? You know what I mean? Like, what if you've got somebody from the city who's trying to go on vacation upstate, they're coming through, maybe they were going 5 over or something, I don't know, but like what's the response to that? You know what I mean?
Yeah, like it wouldn't take much, I think, for a police officer here to be rattled by something that they don't see on the daily. And I don't want to speak for our police department. I don't know their record. I'm just gonna say that straight up. Like but I know that, like, my friends here in high school, or growing up, and like people who were getting involved with drugs and that kind of thing. Like there was a lot more, obviously, police interaction in those regards. And then, like, I had friends that, like, their parents knew the police chief, or they knew an officer, and it was kind of like that old Yankee way of, like, shake hands and be done with it. And not to say that, like, there weren't consequences of any stripe, but it's just like, it is kind of apples to oranges.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Here.
No, yeah, absolutely. It's, we live in a different space, and I like, to that end, I try to think about, like, well, functionally what, to link it around a little bit, like, I remember, at one point when I was in high school, I got arrested because I had weed. I wasn't even high at the time. Like, I was skateboarding, and they were mad at me about that. And like,
Right.
and they pressured me into getting my car searched, and I didn't know my rights, and I learned a thing or two that night. But like, I clearly remember a cop saying to me, like, if you've done nothing wrong, then you've got nothing to hide. And to follow that logic, like, when I think about what are ways that we can kind of like exercise some oversight on our policing here in town, is, I personally am an advocate for, say, like a community task force or council that just regularly sits down and sort of reviews, hey, what are our cops doing? Like what's like, let's look at let's look at all the police logs. Let's see if anybody on our force has shown up on a lorry list. Like, that was legislation that just came through. Like, I think or not legislation, but it was a court decision that I think opens up access to the lorry lists, which is a really big deal, because now we can sort of see when there's internal complaints against police officers. And, and again, I don't want to say that like that's applying to any of our police, but I also, for anybody to understand, like, cops can take a knee with us. They can do all this. And I don't want people to forget about the concept of a platitude, right? Like that there might be a certain amount of like fear and anxiety on the part of the police officer as an individual, knowing who they are, what their occupation is. They haven't been out of jobs this whole time during the pandemic. It's like they're not experiencing that pain, really. I mean, they experience the shift in what they have to do. But I mean, I talked about it recently. Like, the cops are pulling people over less. They're more visible and less active, I guess, is the, or not active, but they're intervening in less stuff. And yeah, I just, like, I wonder if we as a community can't find a way to say, hey, we want to see what you guys are up to, and if you've done nothing wrong, then you've got nothing to hide.
Yeah, I mean, turn it back around for sure. I think this is also an interesting point, and I know we're kind of talking parallels today, and I think a pertinent parallel to in the case of Minneapolis, and is that less than 8% of the officers in the MPD are from Minneapolis. So you've got people coming in from the suburbs that are largely white, and they're policing these communities they know nothing about. And the thing about Minneapolis is it's less than half a million people. It's very much there's a lot of neighborhoods. It's like there's a small metro like downtown, and then it's mostly just neighborhoods and families and that kind of thing. So it's like it wouldn't be impossible to know your community. Um, and I think here is like we have the opposite, where it's like we do have police that live in our localities as far as I know. But what I want to say is, like, I don't know what the police are up to, and that's my privilege as a white person, is because, like, I not like they have no reason to at this point, I hope, to deal with me, or to have any interaction. So so I think, to your point, like, and that's something that I want to work on in this community, is how do we get more visibility and transparency with our police force? How do we know what they're up to other than reading the police logs, which honestly, like, they're laughable to our community, and they would be like insanity to other people. Like, it's onion level stuff.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely.
It's
I
like
mean,
someone left a pickle, like, out in front of the movie theater. Like,
yeah, 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 yeah. I mean, like, I was, my head jumps back to like I think it was like a Stephen Colbert or like a John Oliver segment about like local news, and they're just like, they didn't have anything to do, and they like reenacted a bear running through the woods or something like that. It's like, it can be like kind of comical what we deal with out here in the sticks, by comparison, but it's like, I just like, I always just try to keep in mind though that, there's a line that we're fortunate to not cross here right now. But we don't know what could cause that line to be crossed. And our community is really, really good at trying to sort of get out ahead of problems and talk about stuff. And I think that's huge. And I think this is like, I've been trying to take some time to really read up on like, all right, how does New Hampshire deal with police right now? Just in general, like, what are our laws surrounding that? And it's really quite vague. I was looking over the town and looking at sort of the code book. And we just don't really have anything in it that specifically talks about police. We have a lot of documents that essentially describe what we expect our community to do and how we expect our community to act, and like, and I think it's generally stuff that like we all agree is like, yeah, this is civilized society, right? Like, but it makes me wonder, like, maybe we should just kind of enter into a little bit of oversight dialogue about like what are we missing? If we look at like, if we're so focused on restorative justice and caring for our community and getting people involved, then let's like, why not take that kind of a step,
right. And like we have to be part of the national conversation. Like, we can't, like, that's the biggest issue we're facing in and to call it an issue is bizarre, but like that we're facing in Peterborough is that, like, I think people, like, and you might have read my letter to the editor, but like, people are kind of in this blissed out days here often.
Yeah.
Like, they're on their afternoon hikes, and they're like, and I, just in the past week alone, like, I'll take my dog out for a walk, and like, people are like, they're in this mind fog of like nothing can, like, not even coronavirus or anything can like shake them. And it's like, that is such a problem. Like, I'm, I'm not saying like I need to see white tears. Like I'm not looking for that, but
Yeah.
I really don't want that either. I just want people to like feel, feel something though. Like you
Right.
have to be tapped into what's happening right now, and so I'm losing my train of thought here, but like back to so our policing, like we, so here's what I'm noticing too, like with all these protests, is that like, it's now in over like 150 cities nationwide.
All 50 states.
Yes, right. So, and we've seen just in the week alone, there's already been more murders of Black lives. There's been, paramilitary and military tactics harming and hurting, civilians on the streets every day. And police are responding in a way where they're terrified. Like you can like their response is that they're feeling terror from people that are unarmed.
Right. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
like so like it's insanity. But like their response is like, and I don't know if you saw, and it feels ridiculous to keep being like, well, did you see this video? Did you see that video? But like, but specifically in Atlanta, there were those 6 police officers that dragged those 2 teenagers out of their car. They smashed the windows in. They tased, both the passengers in the vehicle before they got out of the vehicle.
Right.
And, and so they
was that the one where it starts out with the white girl smiling and waving at the camera?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Like,
and then the person filming it is saying, come to me, which I assume maybe she's talking to, people that were in the area to protect them.
Mm-hmm.
And, and you're hearing screaming in the background, and it's just like, it's, it's state-sponsored terror. And so, like, we can't assume that even though we have the quote-unquote, like, friendly, good neighbor officers here, that's not a potential reality. And like even like Chris Sununu was asked his response to Trump's dominate, we need to dominate remarks. And he kind of like, of course he didn't outright like say, well, those are the president's words, those are my words, like,
right.
He didn't outright condemn it, but he also didn't deny that, like, he'd pull in the National Guard in an instant if necessary. And so, like, that's kind of what we're looking at. And it's like, there are, like, in spite of New Hampshire being a majority, white state, like, we do have urban populations. Like, we do have more, diverse city centers that, where this could also, go south. I mean, as far as I've been hearing, like, I think most of the gatherings in the state have been pretty peaceful, but, everyone everywhere is angry and like has every reason to be angry. And they're, so.
Well, and I mean, I mean, I'm looking right now. It looks like Manchester police, stopped. There were some, I guess, dumpster fires in Manchester. 1:36 a.m. South Willow Street, crowd has left the area. A couple dumpster fires were taken care of by MFD. Thank all agencies that helped us out tonight. So I mean, it's like, people are pretty fed up here too, and I know that there was definitely a lot of peaceful protest in Manchester last night. I know that the vigil was really productive in that sense. So, it is important for folks to understand though that like they'll roll it out, and something I kind of want to like appeal to. I guess some of the more like liberty-minded folks is like really like let's take a hard look at what authority means right now and the way it manifests in different kinds of communities. And there's part of me that really like, it's one thing to watch things go down in a city. If we were to actually have our police in this area all of a sudden just kind of like turn on a dime like that, right? I feel like we might have a lot less control and a lot less management of it because of the way we're spread out here. It would be much easier for a cop to get away with doing something horrible because there's not a crowd of people. We are like in your yard all the time. And that's like, people can shout about, like, oh, well, just arm yourself and everything. Like, I don't know that that's necessarily going to actually, like, that's just creating further tension, right? Like, I'm not against the Second Amendment by any means, but the thing I always try to point out to people is I'm like, look, if you want to try and solve this by arming yourself, you're creating a premise that operates based off of confrontation rather than collaboration. And that's always sort of like the fundamental thing that I like, it's like I would rather, find a way to mediate than to take something to a court. I would be like any time that there's a situation like that. And I think that's where, saying, hey, let's examine what we've got going on in our towns is probably a healthier way rather than just, boarding up with a bunch of weapons.
Right. And I think too, and as you mentioned that, like, where do we learn that weapons are a response?
Yeah.
Like we have learned that violence from our police. We have learned that from our military. We have learned that that's a part of our conflict because the Constitution has made way for it. And I'm personally not a Second Amendment advocate by any stretch. And but I mean, people like to some degree. I mean, like in Minneapolis, there's a lot of white supremacists that are patrolling neighborhoods at night, very late hours of the night, and there's been seizure of assault rifles already and improvised explosives, and that's happening. That's happening every night since this started.
Right.
And granted, like, those people have been here, so, for as long as white people have been around, but so yeah, like, I don't want to see the people's militia versus the armed militia. It's like so I think, to your point though, it's like, and having oversight here, having a network, and it, I hesitate to call it a community watch, because I think that look at Trayvon Martin, and I think there's some ramifications with that, but I do think, like, starting to talk to our neighbors more, that's got to happen. We've got it, like, because I've lived here, born and raised here almost 30 years, and like, I haven't known most of my neighbors. Like, a lot of my neighbors, or people have come in and out of the neighborhood, and like just now that I've moved back to the area, like, I'm starting to talk to my neighbors more, and it's awesome. Like, I love it. And I don't know if that's like a aging thing where we just, like, you get to a certain point where it's like you realize you can talk to the adults in your life.
Yeah, totally.
But yeah, I mean, by and large, it's like, we are very spread out, and like we would, it would be hard to have, an immediate response, but we are also in a small enough area. And I think, like, the trend right now, and it's not a trend, but it's the idea of more community oriented justice is involving mental health workers, involving first responders, people to de-escalate, clergy. It's like it really has to be a community based thing where, like, weapons aren't arriving on the scene from a police officer. Like, there isn't that, like, dangling threat of potential more violence. So um, yeah, it's something that probably hasn't clocked in on a lot of people's radar in this area. Like it's probably a long off thought, and um, but I mean the country's boiling over. Like we so whether Peterborough gets hit or not, or caught up in this groundswell, um, we do need to know what um, the people that are supposed to serve and protect us are up to. Like that's just bottom line.
Yeah, definitely. And like, and it's also, when I think about it, it's like we've been fairly decent over the years about trying to like get out ahead of stuff.
Mhm.
Like when I look at the way this community acted when COVID hit, it's
Mhm.
like it was so quick, and I mean, I have my own personal gripes about like, I wish more people would wear masks. I know that it's summer and it's nice and everything like that, but like, please just wear your mask. It's not for, you're helping everybody else when you do that, not yourself.
Right.
But like, but I do think about the rapid response at which we all tried to deal with things. I mean, the amount of outpouring support for local businesses that we all really really care about. Like, um, that's awesome. And I knew that, I was like, I know all three of the selectmen personally. I think they're all really good people, and I think they all act accordingly, all like basically all the time. Um, and I was really happy to see that response. And I think it's they're good at handling it, frankly. And
Mhm.
I think it's totally something that we can do right now to throw it at them and be like, hey, what do you guys, how do you feel about us trying to interact with this a little bit more? Let's try and get out of ahead of it, just like we do with every other thing that comes flying at us. And to that end, it is a progressive community because we're trying to, and that, or in the idea of restorative justice, that we're trying to fix the problem before it occurs.
Right.
And that's never something that we should shortchange. And I mean, as much as I'm totally a like, every time you make an improvement, you got to raise the floor and start from scratch. Like, I absolutely believe that. You know what I mean? Like,
Mhm.
I don't
Yeah.
want to
Yeah.
ever ignore the good work that people have done. It just doesn't mean that we are done.
Right. And to that point too, like, there are people here that, are becoming activated for the first time in their lives or becoming more activated, more vocal. I mean, there was an action last Saturday that I participated in where we stood on the highway, on the side of the highway.
Right.
And and it felt like a start. It felt like there's definitely I want to give people credit here. I don't want to paint this picture that nobody cares here and nobody's interested in solving this and nobody wants to talk about it. But I do get the sense that there are going to be people that just given the nature of where we live and the politics of where we live that this doesn't affect them. This doesn't carry weight and um, it's like, all right, where as people say, it's like, where are you, the all lives matter people? Like where
Right.
um but really, like, you, you can't possibly not be affected by this. Like people are people are dying, like really amazing, beautiful people that have lived with so much pain and so much anger and um have been so underserved, you
Mhm.
know um like it's
Yeah.
inexcusable. It's
Right.
inexcusable.
Well, and I think, for us, I think about like, all right, we're like two white dudes ostensibly talking to a bunch of other white people because that's
Mhm.
probably who's watching this. Um, like, I try like, all right, what can we say to each other that helps move things forward? And the best I've got is talking about big action. Um, you know, saying slogans, saying, you know, oh, abolish the police or defund the police, or, you know, even to reiterate Black Lives Matter. It's like, look, that's not necessarily the most pressing thing that you can do right here, right now. We're in a community where we actually have the chance to turn that rhetoric into policy. Mm-hmm. And that's the page that we all need to get on. You know, like, that's like for us, if we really want to be productive, let's start digging into the weeds. Let's start looking at our law. Let's start inspecting what can be done meaningfully in our community to make sure that the like those things that we see never have to like hit our doorstep any more than they already have. And then, you know, the other thing too is I just try to tell people, like, you know, in this area, something that I think we can all kind of like, another way for us to truly connect with this, because I think that's like, as much as this movement is absolutely about, like, is first and foremost about the death of George Floyd, the idea that people would go in every single state would go out and protest by the tens of thousands, in some cases hundreds of thousands, you know, like, the idea that it's just about that one thing is a little, it doesn't address the problem. It doesn't address the fact that a lot of the looting that occurred was people that were like, really, there were a lot of people that were trying to reclaim their own value as workers, and in a context of like economic strife, that this is, you know, like white kids aren't throwing their bodies onto their black friends to prevent the cops from beating them just because that kid is black. Like, that white kid is doing that because they're fed up with having to watch probably their friends or their relatives get addicted to heroin, and knowing that that's a byproduct. Like, they have their own struggles that have informed them to say, no, if I don't put my body in front of this person right now whose experience is even worse than mine, then this won't stop. And it's like that economic dynamic is really something that I think like we gotta take into account the way capitalism, like, broadly has really affected this whole thing, the way it plays into this whole process. The fact that for the most part, at least at the beginning of the protests, the vast majority of places that were burned were like AutoZone, Target, McDonald's, like, you know, whatever. And that's going after big box stores that are completely insured, and they're not even meant to stand that long anyways. So I think that might be a way that we can talk about it, that white folks in this area can relate to, and then maybe try and look at black labor activists and look at writings. You know, there was a segment on Democracy Now! 2 days ago. I think it was like 2 mornings ago. They had Cornel West, Bakari Sellers, and Kianga Yamada Taylor on. And like, for anybody that hasn't watched that segment, I would really like encourage going and checking that out, because, you know, like 3 of the most important black voices in the conversation right now nationally, period, as far as I'm concerned. And they really crystallize a lot of what I am probably very clumsily trying to describe here. And so, like, you know, I always try to think like, who are your go-to black voices right now that you're listening to?
That I'm listening to. Honestly, it's like I'm kind of digging more into sort of my local, like, people that are on the ground right now. Mm-hmm. You know, Nadira McGill is someone. She's from Minneapolis. She's you know, in a band. They're in a band called Gully Boys. I feel ridiculous, like, drawing these blanks. You know, I've been picking up James Baldwin and getting back into reading him, and The Fire Next Time. I mean, it's a letter to his nephew that is devastating, and it's like that letter is written over and over and over and over. Mm-hmm. But I do want to get, and this is work that I need to do, and, you know, I'm going to say this right, you know, straight up, like, I need more black voices in my life. I need to be listening to more to more people.
I as well, you know,
that's like, yeah. And But what I do want to kind of circle back to, and I do want to talk about capitalism, because that does obviously that's a huge part of this, is grief. And like we can, capitalism is like that's the easy way in, but I think grief is like, it's something that we are all going to experience, and we all have experienced. Um, and for me, like in my own life, like I've experienced the most grief I've ever had in the past year. And we have to understand Black grief and trauma, and every single day Black people being killed, every single day people of color being killed and harassed. And when you lose someone, I mean, that is a irreparable hole. You can never fill that hole. You can never recover from that. And that turns to pain very quickly. It turns to bitterness. It turns to fires. It turns to looting. And I'm not like, I really don't want to focus much on looting, because the mainstream media is that is their soundbite, that they are, they love to show it. They love to capitalize on that. And they're, like largely responsible for promoting, I mean, they recycle that that visual over and over and over. And I think, like what people are failing to understand, and like you've probably seen it everywhere, but it's like, this country, was looted from Native Americans. Like we are built on looting. Like this is what white people do. That's capitalism. Like that is, like, it is stealing money. Like military budgets, police budgets, politics is all about looting. And because it's like so easy to show someone take a pair of shoes, because that's the most literal definition of looting. Like that is like so insignificant. It is so insignificant. And like people just get so stuck on it.
No, you're right. And to that end, like I always try to say to people, like when if you're feeling foggy about that, right? Like not you specifically, but like if anybody who's watching this, if you're feeling foggy on like, geez, how did this all come to pass? Really important book that everybody should check out. It's free on the internet. It's really easy to get through audiobook form too, is Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. Just the first maybe like quarter of that does an excellent job at explaining just how like incessantly robbed the people who actually held all of this land really were. And it also gets at some of the like the real true like metropolitan areas that used to exist prior to the Spanish coming up through Mexico. And like, it's like that was a developed civilized society. And like when people sort of say like, well, what do you propose instead of the police? I say, look at reservation models, like look at what indigenous peoples, and like there was a really good document from an indigenous group in Canada that I'll try to get a link out to. It's like, and they were talking about how they deal with policing in their community. And like, it's like probably like the one society that we really could learn the most from at this point, going way back into our history, like 400 years, is also the one that's like the true OG in terms of like just being looted and killed and raped and pillaged and like the whole deal. We're the native people of this country, and that goes completely unaddressed like virtually every day. And what this country does to Black people now is just a modern warfare version of the same thing. And while still just keeping indigenous people down as much as possible. I think, it's like over half of kids on a res are homeless, technically. That's horrible because we do nothing. But I've learned through stuff like Zinn and other places, that's a real wealth of information for us that we should be looking at as well, historically speaking.
Yeah, I mean, it's there's too many examples of how we've continued to function in this way, and so it's inconceivable that people are surprised. If anyone is surprised right now, like, you have some serious work to do.
Right.
Like, and the leader of the Minneapolis, NAACP, she said it, at the Capitol building, that she sat down with mayors and governors and said, this city will burn. And this was, years ago. Like, this city will burn if our needs aren't met.
Yeah.
If you don't start taking us seriously and policy seriously, like, this city will burn. And it has. And, like, and we can try and get really pedantic about, well, is it outside agitators, that phrase,
Yeah.
or is it people that are rising up in the cities, and you know what, frankly, it's both. And I don't, for me, like, the fires, that's, it's like, it's very hard to see that damage happen, but, like, you're right, it's like, it started with AutoZone, it started, Arby's, like, these are places that, like, are paying people slave wages, that, like, have so, like, bucket loads of money. Like, they're not gonna take a hit from this. And people are bemoaning it. And I, honestly, like, and I'm gonna say it right now, is that, like, when I saw the 3rd precinct burning, I was on another level. Like, I was stoked.
Like, yeah, and I understand that,
because that, like, the symbolism of that moment, no matter, like, and it's not clear, like, how that started, who did it, and I don't want to. That's not important to me.
Right.
That moment, what that said was that the people do have the power.
Mm-hmm.
The people do have the power. The police are afraid of the people. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily good either, but like, these power structures, they can't be more powerful than us. They can't be more powerful than what our needs are.
Right.
And so that was huge. That, like, kind of kicked this off, and it's harrowing to see. And it's like, I have so much love and admiration and fear for my friends that are on the ground right now in these cities, and that I know are, they're out in the streets, and they've been cleaning up, and they've been running donations and coordinating donations, and, like, they are calling and emailing and writing, and, like, so none of that would have happened if the fire didn't start burning.
Right. Like, yeah.
Exactly. I mean, none of this would have happened if, police stopped killing Black people, but, like,
yeah, and you can what about that all the way to, like,
right.
to history, but the I think that's the thing that I definitely, like, always try to remind people is, like, hey, the peaceful protesting has been really, like, deeply tried for a long time, and it's like, and I, again, on our community level, the idea of, like, really hammer in peaceful protest. I mean, I grew up at the UU church, mm-hmm. and that type of social justice thing is a huge part of what they teach there. And I attribute it a lot to, like, me going to, when I did finally go to the city and be like, oh, okay, I'm going to shut up now, as opposed to, like, oh, I'm going to talk about myself. That's a really, like, that's a key component of our community. And I'm like, God, I mean, I'm losing my own train of thought now. It's just, I mean,
spreading, man.
Yeah, well, I think, that's definitely a function of what's going on right now. And I think, it's like, last night I was listening to the Michael Brooks show, and he had Matt Christman from Chapo Trap House on, and Matt was talking about literally being out in the streets of New York. And this is a guy who's like really known for being super like boisterous and like a really loud personality, and watching Matt sit there just like really flabbergasted and exhausted and just being like, look, you can sit here and you can look at this through the internet in this little box. He's like, that does not even remotely express to you the magnitude of what it's like to be on the ground. And when I think about the empathy education that a lot of people in this community are given, I would say on that level, when you're talking about like the pain, the hurt, we'll be able to know how to act when we can truly use the empathy that we're taught to, as best we can, truly like imagine the experience ourselves. Like if we can't go to the city right now to do the protest ourselves, if you can't make it to Manchester, you can't make it to Boston, just like, think of a video that you watched. Like I can't imagine anybody that hasn't. Think of a video watched. Go sit down and close your eyes for a second and imagine what it's like to stand in that crowd, to smell that tear gas, to hear those flashbangs. Like really try to embody that feeling. Like use whatever you've got to associate that. Like if you remember a car backfiring outside of your house because you never heard a flashbang grenade before, use that sound. Like create it in your head and try and use the most realistic experiences that you've had to recreate that understanding for yourself, so that we can really know like the trauma or the the anxiety trigger that a black person feels when they just see a cop car maybe like sitting outside the Dunkin' Donuts. Right.
And where we have to start too, on that path to empathy is I had a gem, I had a jewel, and it just completely evaporated. I'm sorry.
No, you're good.
But I mean, like, we're talking empathy.
Yeah.
I lost it, but if you got something, jump in, and maybe it'll come back.
I think I think it's just like, it really is about like, like I think about it in terms of like, okay, right? So like I myself, I'm sure everybody at this point knows that I'm like a creative person, that I'm an artist, and that's something that's a really heavy emphasis of our community, right? And that sort of tactile experience is why what I jump to when I try to like understand these things. And I think something that like we really shouldn't shortchange in our community is the way that our empathy is tied in our creativity. And then to understand the impact creativity really has on politics itself. Like I learned something interesting the other day, that one of the key people that helped Vladimir Putin get into office was an oligarch who spent a really long time. I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but like he spent a long time making his money in the avant-garde art scene. And he completely destabilized the Russian social discourse by applying direct concepts of avant-garde abstract art to like his political action, right? So he would support Putin and then support Putin's opponents. He would give money to a women's rights abortion group and then give money to neo-Nazis and then come out publicly and say, hey, I gave money to all these people. And then all of a sudden everybody couldn't trust, right? Like they couldn't trust what he was doing anymore. So they just lose trust in the system. So they just don't care anymore. So they let Putin, this KGB troll, get into office, on the heels of Yeltsin. And he's in there because Yeltsin knows that he's not going to get prosecuted because he and Putin agreed to that ahead of time, and I look at that whole dynamic, right? And the first thing I think of is I'm like, wow, art and creativity could be the most influential thing to our politics. And the way you get there is like understanding that conceptualization and that level of experience and that that ability to subject yourself to an experience, which I would say is a type of empathy, right? Like it's a type of experiential empathy, and that has the power to really move and shape things, right? And it's in that artistic world where like you spend a lot of time debating ideas only, right? Like, you know, I know that from my experience at art school, I know that you've had similar experiences with writing, where like there's no right or wrong answer there. Like when you walk into those conversations, you're talking about a concept, and then you're going to inspect the concept, and you're going to grill that notion, and you're going to try and explore, well, okay, well, what does it mean if I do this with it or that with it? You know, like the way you shape and mold that, right, is a way that we can also understand everyday life and how we choose to like create rules and boundaries that we have with each other. And to that end, I think like this community has that leg up again on the creativity front, that we can maybe try and understand some of our politics in that way too. And for a good way. I'm not advocating that we act like the guy who completely destabilized Russia, but like I also believe in learning from my enemies, you know, and I like the idea of taking my enemy's tactic and flipping it around on them, because I feel like if we actually, you know, if you're really standing on the morally superior high ground in that instance, then your implementation of the tactic for good will likely defeat the implementation of the tactic for bad, because you'll just end up getting the majority on your side, because everybody kind of like once educated on the topic actually arrives at a pretty sane conclusion.
And I think like I was just having this sort of thought while you were bringing that up, that like, you know, I kind of think of like art as journalism. I don't think of journalism as art, to be clear.
Yeah.
And you have to investigate. You have to investigate your humanity and the humanity beyond you, and the world that you're in. And you know, another way for white people to digest what's happening in the world is to see it right in front of them. Like, you know, white people love galleries, man. Like, it's just like you know, and people can have that feeling, or you know, and especially, you know, like I, you know, come from, you know, from a poetry background, and you know, a writer that comes to mind for me, you know, that I should have mentioned earlier, is Dinesh Smith. I mean, like he is, you know, he's written several collections of poetry now, and it's just such a distillation of like of the Black experience, and like in every facet. I mean, he, you know, I'm being really vague right now, but and also kind of running out of steam as we've discussed that. You know, it's exhausting times, but I you know, I think that is a good place to go as far as opening our hearts, and to go toward healing, and a place that's accessible and often free. Um, you know, and to but also, yeah, that idea of there's so much room to play, and to play the other side, and to bring the other side to you, and you know, dabble with that. So um I think that's an important place to be looking right now as well, you know.
Awesome. Well, hey, I mean, I think we're both starting to get a little burnt here, so we'll call it for a day, and I'll catch you later this afternoon. Actually, I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah.
So you know, and anybody, I don't, you know, we're meeting up to try and just discuss some of the, I mean, hopefully discuss in more of a group setting some of the things that we just talked about here.
Yeah.
And, you know, and part of the reason I was like excited to have this happen was so that we could sort of preserve some of those ideas, you know, in this instance. And obviously, you know, like it's always good for people to jump into the comments, or, you know, and continue the discussion there. That's really healthy. So Zach, thanks so much for coming on today, man.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah,
man. Awesome.
Yeah, awesome. We'll catch you later.
All right.
Take care.
You too.
All right, everybody. So that was Zach Green, Zach Zalman Green. just really total pleasure to have him on. And I hope to have him back for other stuff too, because it's, you know, like, I think there's a whole element of creativity and literature that we could get into. Just, you know, I like, it's rough right now. It's really rough right now trying to deal with everything that's just happening. It's like, it's madness. And I want everybody to try and just, you know, like, you know, find that space inside where you can feel comfortable knowing that, you know, like, not being able to do more than what you can do is okay. You know, there are ways right now that, you know, like, if you don't have money, you can show support to BLM and other ways. There's a YouTube video, which I'll try and get a link up to. You know, if you're feeling like, just, if you really feel like you can't do anything else, put that YouTube video up and just turn off your ad blocker. That's all you got to do. You just got to turn off your ad blocker, and when the video is over, just refresh the page. Listen to it. There's a bunch of amazing Black voices and artists. If you just gotta listen to other stuff, or you can't have it on all day, you can even just mute it and just let the video play in the background. But that's a way. That's a way that, even with no money, that you can help raise money for BLM right now. So, yeah, thanks everybody for tuning in. This was a nice little special stream. I'm gonna try and come back tomorrow, do some more. We'll see what happens. I don't know if I'm gonna have a guest or not. I'll try and get something lined up, but it's gonna be kind of a packed evening, and I don't know. It might take me a minute to get clips of this interview out, but again, I'm gonna work really hard at getting it all in for everybody. This has been a madness week, so there's just a lot of content that needs to just get made, and I do this whole thing solo. You know, I get help from a partner, Sarah, here and there, you know, when she's got the time and this ability, you know, is able to contribute footage or segment concepts. She's got her own thing going on, and so these live streams, it's a lot of work. So, you know, obviously, if you have, please go and donate to other places first, but you know, you can support us on Patreon if you're feeling up to it right now. Again, this isn't about making money. This is about making sure that people can hear these ideas and get them out there. All these videos are free. I'm not going to lock them up. I'm not going to hide them from people, because that's not the time right now. If you like this stuff, support it. And support your community, and go out to these functions, go out and protest, get involved, try and do research, listen to Black voices, read Black authors. That's what we can do right now. That's what we in this incredibly white ass community can do right now. So thank you folks for tuning in. It's been a great segment today, and we'll catch you tomorrow.